Good afternoon. Today I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to talk about Rome. As you see, this is a PowerPoint, so I will run through it. I'll give you my views on Rome. It's ancient Rome from monarchy through republic to empire. And here we go with the most fascinating period in ancient history, at least for me. Rome is by far the most interesting and consequential period in ancient history. Um, and its reach is and consequences are felt even today. So let's begin. Okay, so here we have a Roman timeline, and essentially, most people don't know this, but Rome began as in the royal period. That is not the imperial period, but the traditional timeline for Rome begins with the seven kings. And it's after its foundation. The foundation date is actually we have it to a specific date. It's April 20th, 753 BCE. I'm going to use the terms before the Common Era and Common Era to differentiate the periods. That is, BC is roughly equivalent to BCE, and CE is roughly equivalent to AD, and that is not after death, but Anno Domini, year of our Lord. It begins the Christian period. Um, so Rome begins with seven kings, probably legendary, because it's their average length of reign. Their reigns are averaging about 34 years, and that just seems to be too long for seven successive monarchs. We have their names, and some of them are clearly legendary. The reigns themselves are probably legendary. And of course, that begins with Romulus, who's also known as Quirinus. The Romans identify themselves as Quirites uh, because of Romulus. And of course, Romulus is of Romulus and Remus fame, the legendary twins that were suckled by the she-wolf after their usurping uncle basically asked a shepherd to kill them. The shepherd, of course, when you do this in ancient mythologies, it never pans out. The shepherds invariably failed in their mission to kill the twins. And of course, these twins, the reason why their uncle doesn't want to do the deed themselves is because they are reputed to be the sons of Mars, with Rhea Silvia, the daughter of the legitimate monarch who was overthrown by his brother. And therefore, he doesn't want to do it, but he sends a shepherd to do it, and invariably the shepherd fails. He leaves the children in the woods, and they're found by the she-wolf, which suckles them and takes them to her cave, which is interestingly enough, the Romans believed that the cave was on the Palatine Hill, and it is near the actual residence of Augustus Caesar. Recent excavations have found the place where the Romans believed the cave was located. And of course, these two then uh, overthrow their uncle and then return to Rome, where they establish the foundations of the city. Ultimately, they have a falling out, and Romulus kills Remus, after Remus challenges him. Of course, the tradition is that Romulus saw 12 eagles in the sky, where Remus only saw 7. And therefore, the omens were that Romulus was to be the legitimate king. Of course, Romulus rules. There is the famous rape of the Sabine women. Rape in the ancient context was always about abduction, not the sexual violation. They abducted the men who followed Romulus, were rough and ready toughs, and they needed women. They then raided the near settlement, the Sabine settlement. They took the women, and by the time the Sabines were able to respond, these women were either pregnant or had been taken in marriage by the Romans, and that ultimately, traditionally, probably legend, led to a peace treaty between the Romans and the Sabines, establishing a kind of alliance that would last for a time. Then traditions go on to say that Romulus either disappeared or was, in other traditions, murdered. Um, but most of the Roman traditions talk about him as ascending to heaven and becoming the god Quirinus. He was followed by Numa Pompilius. Numa Pompilius is credited with Roman religion. The traditions behind Roman religion are ascribed to Numa Pompilius. Um he was then followed by Tullius Hostilius, conquest of the general area of Latium, the struggles between the different peoples in central Italy, because the Romans believed that Rome or Italy really was Latium. They didn't consider the north to be part of the tradition of the peninsula, rather seeing that as the where the um, scary blonde people resided, and the Celts, the long-haired, long-limbed, blonde, blue-eyed barbarians who uh, ate butter and drank beer, horrible things to the Romans, instead of the traditional civilized wine and olive oil. And but that was the tradition under Tullius Hostilius. Then Ancus Marcius, consolidation of that conquest, is attributed to him. And then we have an interesting situation, because the next king is Tarquinius Priscus. And that name, Tarquin, is an Etruscan name. The Etruscans lived to the north of the Romans. We know that they exerted a tremendous influence on Roman culture, and that they, for some time, probably ruled Rome, although the Romans never acknowledged that subjugation as Romans would. But Tarquinius Priscus, is clearly an Etruscan name, and therefore leads some historians to believe that there was a period of Etruscan domination of the Romans. Um, After that, you have a very important ruler who is Servius Tullius. His name Servius indicates that at some point he might have been a slave, or the freedman son of slaves. But Servius Tullius is uh, credited with establishing the Roman political system. That is the establishment of Roman citizenship based on membership in the popular assemblies. That is the Centuriate assemblies, about 193 of them, which was basically structured around wealth, and not only wealth, but linked military obligations, very much like the Greek system at the time, and uh, the tribal assembly. Tribal, not about, at least maybe initially it was, but not ultimately, uh, defining a kinship group, but an area where one resided. That is, if you resided in one of 33 areas, you belonged to a particular tribe in Rome. Four of those tribes basically were urban. The other 29 were rural, and you had to belong to one of those tribal assemblies to fully participate in the political process in Rome. You had to belong to the 193 initial centuries to participate in the political system as well. And that was again structured. The tribal assembly was structured around location, and the centuriate assembly was based on wealth and reciprocal military obligations. That is, the wealthier you were, the more the higher your obligations to Rome militarily, the contributions to Rome militarily. Um, so Servius Tullius is credited with the political system that was established and ultimately lasted for a very long time with major uh, changes. But ultimately, the structure was that established by Servius Tullius. Now, Servius Tullius dies in a um, particularly treacherous fashion. His daughter betrays him, and she is associated with the next king, Tarquinius Superbus, again, another Etruscan. And it is Tarquin the Proud or the Angry, who is overthrown in 509 BCE, and that leads to the establishment of the Republic. Rome would have no more kings and would see the figure of a king as unacceptably oppressive to Roman liberties. So the Roman Republic would last from 509 BCE to 27 BCE, and that would be followed by the imperial period from 27 BCE to, you could say, 476 CE in the west, but 1453 CE in the east. That is, the Eastern Roman Empire ultimately did not fall. The city of Constantinople, which was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, would not fall until 1453. So Rome would have a very, very extensive life in one form or another. So to continue, just so you can see the location, basically, of Rome. Rome is located on the Italian peninsula in the center of the Mediterranean Sea. The Alps are to the north, right? These are the Alps, right? I hope you can see them. And the Apennine Mountains are basically on the eastern coast, but they cut through the center of the peninsula. So Italy, you can go north and south fairly easily, but you cannot go east and west with the same ease. Again, in the north and west, but as I said, the Romans saw the north as not really part of the peninsula. They saw that as the land of the Celts, or Gallia, Gaul, on this side of the Alps, and then there was Gaul on the other side. And they didn't see, but they saw that as kind of joint, not part of the peninsula. And then the south from Naples south, they saw as essentially Greek. It was only the central area that they saw as legitimately Italic or Latin, although the present region of Calabria was the first to call their inhabitants Italians or Italy. Okay, so Italy was occupied by many different groups and people. Two main groups were the Greek colonists and the Etruscans. The Etruscans, of course, were located in Etruria. There were several city-states in Confederation, and they ruled much of central Italy and, of course, Rome itself. Ancestors of the Romans settled in that area that is now Rome around 800 BCE. As I said, we have a particular date that the tradition gives us is April 20th, 753, and the Romans would date that as year one from the founding of the city, and their calendar would run in that fashion. That is, until the Christian influence displays that calendar, it would be, the year two, I guess, would be 752. And so on until I think we're in the year 2772 AUC, which is the after the founding of the city. Again, this is the tradition of Romulus and Remus, as you can see. Rome, interestingly enough, had two origin stories. The first one, the first one was associated with Aeneas, a Trojan prince, who flees Troy while it's being destroyed by the Greeks, and then has a series of adventures in the Mediterranean, ultimately landing in central Italy and establishing a city, Alba Longa, which would be the mother city of Rome, that is, establishing the foundations of Rome. And this was the foundation story that Virgil would use in the Aeneid, which is a very interesting epic poem describing Roman traditions concerning their foundations. So Rome is unique in having two foundation stories, because that's one. And then you have Romulus and Remus founding the city. According to the tale, the twins' mother was a Latin woman, Rhea Silvia, and their father was the war god Mars. So the Romans consider themselves sons of Mars, and they really did believe that Rome had a divine mission, a divine purpose, and fully ascribe to this idea of a divine mission. If they lost their faith in the actual tales, they still saw themselves as exceptional. Roman exceptionalism was a real thing. All right, Rome is located on and around 7 hills on the banks of the Tiber. You can see the Tiber there, the Field of Mars, and the different hills. Of course, the Palatine Hill is basically where the wealthy lived, the patricians initially, and Palatine is, of course, the etymology of the word palace is Palatine. The Capitoline Hill is, of course, important, and in that area, between those hills, you have the Roman Forum, and then you run down to the Aventine Hill, which was associated with the plebeian class, that is the lesser the lesser born individuals, the lower social classes. and I hate to say, less wealthy, because ultimately some plebeian families were as wealthy as any patrician family. But they were denied certain basic rights under the Roman Constitution, and they actually, many of them moved out of the Palatine area and the Esquiline area to the Aventine, in what is called the conflict of the orders between the plebeian groups and the patricians, and they seceded from the Roman uh, political system and obtained important rights in the process. And we'll see how the uh, conflict of the orders panned out over time. Initially, Roman government under the kings, we have an elected king and a senate, a royal council, all patricians, and they basically nominated the king. So it was an elective office. And you had the Curiate Assembly. This is not the centuries or Centuriate Assembly. This is another type of assembly that was initially created. It existed throughout Roman history, but it lost its importance. It lost its importance to the popular assemblies of the centuries and the tribal assembly. But you can see that Rome always had a form of constitutional uh, political system, or one structured on a constitutional system. As I mentioned, the Serbian reforms, these were very much like those of Solon and Cleisthenes in Athens. Solon basically struck down aristocratic monopolies on political participation in political offices in Athens, basing a new system on wealth and linked military obligations. Cleisthenes is considered the father of Athenian democracy, and he basically established a democratic system that did away with wealth as a important characteristic of the political process, while kind of structuring everything around location where individuals lived, and popular government. So he's the one that creates a full democracy in Athens, and that achievement is dated to 508. And of course, the Romans, by claiming that their republic was established in 509, preempted the Athenian claim. And Rome would do that because Rome is never second to anyone. But Tullius basically created the centuries, the Centuriate Assembly, 193 centuries. All Romans were placed in these centuries based on wealth and corresponding military service. Servius Tullius is also credited with the establishment of the tribal assembly of the people. 33 tribes, all Romans were placed in a tribe depending on where they lived. So it's not tribe the way we would understand it, but location. Initially might have had some association with tribe or kinship groups, but ultimately it really was based on location, where you lived. These assemblies or committees voted on laws, and later in the Republic elected officers, the officers that would rule Rome. And the Romans were very clear about political offices. They were always to be collegial, that is, there were always to be more than one political officer. And their terms would be very brief. So, briefness and collegiality were essential to the Roman systems. Romans had elections every year, and they would elect at least two officials. each of which could veto the other's actions or counter the other's actions or limit the actions of his colleague. All these centuries and tribes voted in a unit. So it was an electoral system. The one century would show up and they would vote. And if the majority of that century voted for a law or for an officer, that officer or that law would get one vote, and then it would go to 193. But of course, if a majority voted in favor of the law or voted in favor of electing a particular officer, the election would end there. So once you got a majority of 193, it would be enough. So that would end the vote. And so the Romans structured it in a very interesting way. The wealthiest 10% of the population basically controlled about 100 centuries. The next 30% wealthiest controlled another, I think it was another 40 or 15. Let me just take a look. I'm going to reduce this a little bit. Okay. So the next 30% wealthiest controlled the next 70 centuries, and the poorest 60% only about 23 centuries. The tribal assembly, again, placed most of the urban poor in the four urban tribes, while the wealthier class had access to the remaining 29 tribes. And this assembly was not based on wealth, but on residence. But it was, you had to vote in Rome. So if you were poor, you had to travel to Rome. You were also likely indebted to the local or landed elite. So your vote could be shaped or influenced by that landed elite, although that hold was less based on law or a process than on the kind of precedence of and the stature of the local elite. Okay, excuse me here. Okay, so Roman politics. Romans drove out their Etruscan rulers and established a republic. They didn't want one person to have all power. So Republican officers, consuls, praetors, quaestors, aediles, and censors attached to the Senate always served with one or more colleagues, serving in the same office with the power of veto, and served for short periods. So collegiality and briefness of tenure was important. And patricians, nobles, early on monopolized the government and excluded the plebeians, the commoners. The struggle or conflict of the orders was patrician versus plebeian. The conflict of the orders, also referred to as the struggle of the orders, was a political struggle between plebeians, commoners, and patricians, aristocrats of the ancient Roman Republic, lasting from 494 to 287 BC or BCE, in which the plebeians sought political equality with the patricians. It played a major role in the development of the Constitution of the Roman Republic. The conflict began while Rome was at war with two neighboring tribes, and all the plebeians left the city, the first secessio plebis, secession. The result of his first secession was the creation of the office of plebeian tribunes, and with it, the first acquisition of real power by the plebeians. What happened in 494 was that the plebeians left, and the Rome was beset by a war with an enemy. And in order to get the plebeians to come back and participate in the military defense of the city, the patricians had to create the office of tribune of the plebs. That is an officer not associated with the Senate, but an officer that could veto all government actions and could veto the actions of the Senate. There were 10 of them. Again, they were elected for 1 year, but they could veto all government action. And the one things that the plebeians immediately did is that they swore an oath to protect the tribunes from any physical attack by the patricians. And the office of tribune gained this stature and gained the immunity from physical attack, and it would remain that way throughout Roman history. So at first, only patricians were allowed to stand for election to all political offices except the tribunes. Tribunes were always plebeian. But these laws, but over time, though, the laws were revoked, and eventually all offices were opened up to plebeians. Since most individuals who were elected to political office were given membership in the Roman Senate, that is, the consuls, the quaestors, the praetors, the aediles, they were elected, and the senior officers, that is, the consuls and the praetors, were given membership in the Roman Senate. This development helped to transform the Senate from a body of patricians into a body of plebeian and patrician aristocrats. So plebeian aristocrats, that is, people who gained wealth during this period and had a role in defending the city, a military role, which is essential to Roman careers and Roman families. Elite families would not only have to be wealthy, and they certainly were very wealthy, they were equivalent of multimillionaires today, but they also had to provide military service. And it was expected of Roman families, elite families, to provide that military service. But once they did that, they could become part of a new elite that combined both plebeian and patrician aristocrats. Ultimately, the role of the patricians, just as patricians, had a social role. I mean, it was important. It was, I mean, Rome was very much deferential to social status. So it was, if you were a patrician family, it was recognized as such, and you were given deference on that basis. But political power increasingly passed to this combined elite of plebeians and patricians. And ultimately, in 287 BCE, the Senate lost its legally lost its power, and all power was given to the popular assemblies. Now that is interesting, and I'll talk about a little bit either in this video or the next video, how the Romans were able to manage that. But by 287, all laws and all elections had to be were part of the purview of the popular assemblies, and the Senate was relegated to a body of senior fathers, conscript fathers, as senior advisors, who could issue a senatus consultum, their opinion on particular laws or candidates, and invariably their advice would be followed. In fact, only those officers associated with the Senate, that is, the consuls, the praetors could introduce laws in the popular assemblies, and that became an issue that would later lead to civil war because the Romans would, uh, as they became much more contentious in the political process, would seek to uh, uh, um, directly introduce laws in the popular assembly, ignoring the role of the Senate. And this would ultimately lead to a much later struggle um, in the Republic and would pit populares and optimates, optimates being those who wanted laws to be introduced by Senate officials and after the advice of the Senate. And the populares who essentially argued that tribunes or the popular assembly should uh, should actually introduce all legislation and vote on it without the role of the Senate. It would be a very important turn of events, and it would lead to a Roman civil war that would bring down the Republic, along with other factors. I've already done that. Okay. And just to end it for today, the Senate and executive officers, you have the patricians until the end of the conflict of the orders. The consuls were elected for 1 year. Each colleague were to veto the other, chief executive officer, military commanders. These were seen almost as kings. Um, in fact, Polybius, in Book 6 of his history, would argue that Rome had a perfected government because it was a mixed constitution. It was a constitution that had monarchy, and he cited the consuls as and the praetors, quaestors, and so on as kind of establishing a monarchical element in Roman government, while the Senate was the aristocratic component, and the popular assemblies having the democratic factor or providing the democratic structures. He said that because it was a mixed constitution, it was superior to all other constitutions, and the Roman government was superior to all governments. He was looking at the Greeks, city states, and their constitutions. And in fact, Polybius wrote his history of the Romans, trying to understand how the Romans could have defeated the Greeks while fighting a two-front war against the Carthaginians and also against the Hellenistic kingdoms of the Greeks. And one of the primary reasons that Polybius gives in Book 6 is that the Romans had a mixed constitutional system, a mixed government, and therefore it proved to be much more consistent in its policies and much more flexible in managing internal dissent and directing the energies of the state to a particular goal or set of goals for a protracted period. He didn't see that same type of resiliency or consistency in the Greek states. And in Book 6, he makes this point well, quite clearly. That is obviously that tripartite mixed system was later to influence the French philosopher Baron Montesquieu, and in his Spirit of the Laws in 1748, and would influence the founding fathers of the American Constitution into establishing a mixed system with the three branches of government, which you can see. I mean, the president being almost the king or taking the monarchical role, the Senate having the Senate and the House of Representatives having the kind of aristocratic role, certainly the Senate, and the judicial branch having the other role. The judicial branch is kind of an addition. I think Montesquieu talked about the kind of the the three branches, but he essentially tied it to the Roman system of monarchical and then aristocratic, a Senate, and then a House of Representatives having the role of the popular assemblies, that is uh, the democratic element. Now, Rome, as you can see, had an interesting set of officers, and they had a very peculiar office known as dictator. And dictator was basically a dictator was could be elected for 6 months with full power to deal with an emergency and nothing else. But he had absolute power. He could order the deaths of Roman citizens. He could basically act with impunity and immunity. In fact, um, all these offices had immunity. And so, if you were elected as consul, you had immunity. You could not be tried or put in prison for anything you had done within that year. After you lost imperium, that is the power, legitimate power to act, you could be tried. And that was a problem that would later kind of emerge in the days before the fall of the Republic. The dictator, on the other hand, could not be tried. His actions were, or they were immune from prosecution at any time. Well, I'm going to end it there. Hopefully you'll enjoy this, and you can subscribe to this channel. I would appreciate a like and any comments you have on the entire presentation.